Imagine walking deep into a forest where the only sounds are the crunch of leaves underfoot and the wind whispering through the trees. But not all forests are peaceful. Some hold stories, dark, terrifying stories of things that should not be seen, heard, or even believed. From unsettling disappearances to mysterious creatures lurking in the shadows, these 10 real forest horror stories will make you question everything you thought you knew about the woods. So before you head out for your next hike, remember, some places are better left unexplored. Get ready for 10 real forest horror stories that will keep you up at night. Story 1, I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington near Mount Rainier. Like not an official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night I wake up and hear something, open my tent, and there is a guy sitting by where my fire had been right outside my tent. Nothing particularly noteworthy about the guy, just a fairly regular looking dude just sitting there a couple feet from my tent. No bag or pack or anything with him, just a guy. He saw me open the tent, his eyes got huge like he had just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day I managed to put it out of my mind fairly well after writing it off as just some odd occurrence. And a guy that was probably high or something and had somehow managed to set up a camp, coincidentally not far from mine. Then 2 days after that, in 10 to 15 miles away in totally random directions that nobody could take the same path as on accident, I was sitting by the fire that night and started hearing noises that I got more and more convinced were a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness someone was like, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said no. I don't even think that's a real place there. They kept talking from just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that away," and kind of spooked and not wanting to piss off a potentially crazy person. I did. After like 15 minutes of me being very freaked out and them talking and asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer, so I shined my light that way again. And it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had to have followed me almost 15 miles over 2 days because there is no way he could have just accidentally wound up in the same spot as vast as that wilderness is. No possible way. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again. I started to chase him, but didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the dark, so stopped quickly after probably only 100 to 200 feet. This one couldn't be written off because the only way he could have been in both places is specifically if he was following me. I decided the trip was very over first thing in the morning and hiked back out over 3 days, constantly doubling back, trying to throw anyone following off my trail, and occasionally hiding and waiting to see if he would come by following me. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the woods and to actually have to brainstorm on things I could do to best avoid potentially being murdered. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent, but by the time I mustered the courage to look, nobody was there. On the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first in the distance, but slowly decided sounded more like a human, making animal calls, but could have actually been an animal, but I didn't actually see the guy again. But it really sounded like a person making howling noises. I literally almost cried when I finally got back to my car. The relief was so strong. To this day, probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. I have no idea who the guy was or what his intentions were, and no way of getting an explanation, but I really can't articulate just what a terrifying few days it was. A few years ago, my girlfriend and I decided to hike the southern portion of Virginia's Appalachian Trail. We'd explored other sections before, but this one, remote and less traveled, seemed like the perfect adventure. The trail ran through the George Washington and Jefferson National Forests, stretching about 166 miles. Our plan was to start near the Virginia Creeper Trail and finish in Damascus, soaking up the autumn colors and solitude along the way. For the first few days, everything was idyllic. The air was crisp, the scenery stunning, and the trails almost eerily quiet. It felt like we had the whole wilderness to ourselves. That changed on our second to last night. Wanting a bit more privacy, we left the trail and set up camp in a small clearing we found off the beaten path. It seemed perfect, until I was shaken awake around 2 a.m. "Get your gun," my girlfriend whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone's outside the tent." I froze, my heart pounding as I reached for my Judge revolver. "What did you hear?" I asked quietly. It sounded like a knife, dragging along the tent, and footsteps. "They're circling us." I strained to listen. At first there was silence, then snap, crunch, snap. Footsteps, deliberate and slow, just beyond the tent. I slid out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent carefully, flashlight off, gun in hand. The fire had burned low, leaving the clearing dimly lit by the moon. I crouched in the dark, waiting, listening. When I finally turned on the flashlight, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement behind a tree. "I'm armed!" I yelled into the woods. "Get the hell out of here!" At first there was nothing. Then I heard it, someone running through the underbrush to my right. A second later, more footsteps retreated from another direction. My stomach sank. There were two of them. I didn't dare chase anyone in the dark. I retreated into the tent and stayed awake, keeping watch until sunrise. In the morning, I found a boot print near the tent, too large to belong to either of us. I didn't tell my girlfriend, not wanting to scare her more, but my gut told me we were being followed. We packed up quickly and hiked fast that day, stopping only when we found a campsite near a cliff with limited access. That night, exhaustion got the better of me, and I dozed off until I woke to the sound of someone rifling through our stuff. In the faint firelight, I saw a silhouette crouch near our packs. "We're armed!" I shouted. "Get out of here!" The figure bolted, crashing into the woods. I stepped outside, gun in hand, and saw the mess they'd left behind. Food and gear were scattered everywhere. Then, down by a creek, I noticed a flickering lantern. My heart sank as 3 more lights appeared in the distance, weaving through the trees. "We're leaving." "Now," I said. We grabbed what we could and left the tent behind, hiking into the night. The walk back to the car was tense. Branches snapped around us, and at one point, I swear I heard voices. As dawn broke, I turned back and saw a figure standing on the trail behind us, watching. They didn't follow, just stood there until I lost sight of them. When we finally reached the car, we were completely drained, but we didn't stop until we were miles away. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, and I don't care to find out. The woods can keep their secrets. I'm never going back. Last Sunday, my boyfriend, let's call him B, my parents and I decided to visit Goatman's Bridge in Denton, Texas, a spot notorious for paranormal activity and its dark history. B and I love ghost hunting, and being curious agnostics, we couldn't resist checking it out. We'd heard the stories and seen the Ghost Adventures episode, but nothing prepared me for what happened next. We arrived around 10 p.m., hoping for a spooky adventure. At first, the bridge itself felt eerie but uneventful. The real unease began on the trails. The first was quiet, the second revealed glowing eyes in the distance, probably a deer, but the third was different. We stumbled across a graffiti-covered altar with pentagrams, disturbing phrases like, "We all die," and symbols we couldn't decipher. Later, B found out it's reportedly used for modern-day dark rituals. My nickname, Jen, was even scrawled in one spot, hidden within other letters. It chilled me to the bone. As we headed back to the bridge, we noticed a group of men sitting silently in the dark. No flashlights, no talking, just smoking cigarettes in an unsettling way. Something about them felt wrong. When we got back to the car, that's when everything changed. The nausea hit me like a wave. By the time we got home, it was unbearable. So much worse than anything physical could explain. When I looked in the bathroom mirror, I didn't recognize myself. My eyes stared back at me, but they weren't mine. It felt like something hateful, violent, was looking through me. B noticed the change immediately. He told me to lie down, but it didn't help. I remember telling him, "I'm not Jen." My voice, my thoughts, my feelings, they were all wrong. I felt this overwhelming urge to hurt him. I dug my nails into my palms to stop myself, but I couldn't feel the pain. Even my dog avoided me. It felt like something was inside me, learning me, trying to become me. That night was the worst, but even now I feel like I'm not entirely myself. The nausea lingers whenever I think about it or look at the photos we took. Speaking of which, in nearly every picture, there's a strange red pixel that I can't explain. It feels wrong, like those dots are watching me. I can't bear to look at them for long. They make me physically sick. B did more research afterward and found that women often experience stronger reactions at Goatman's Bridge, particularly tied to a malevolent spirit named Steve. I can't say much more about him without feeling worse, but whatever happened that night, it hasn't let me go. If you're thinking about going to Goatman's Bridge, don't. I live near Toronto, Ontario, and tonight the news said there was a chance to see the Northern Lights again. Back in May, I saw them with friends, but this time no one was available to join me. I decided to go alone, planning to drive 4 hours to Algonquin Park, hike into the forest, make a campfire, and stargaze. Even if the auroras didn't show, stargazing was worth the trip. 2 hours into the drive, my friend texted me saying there was no forecast for the Northern Lights, but I kept going anyway. By hour 3, the road was pitch black. No cars, no lights, just trees and stars. I was on a call with a buddy to pass the time, marveling at how beautiful the stars were. He suggested I pull over to take some pictures, so I found a spot, turned off my car lights, and stepped out. The sky was incredible, but after about 5 minutes, the forest went silent. No wind, no rustling, just dead quiet. I felt a sudden unease. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped into the woods, scanning for animals. Then I heard rustling. I turned and saw it. Something standing on its hind legs about 50 meters away. Its glowing orange-red eyes locked onto mine. It wasn't a bear. It was too tall, too unnatural. I whispered to my friend about what I was seeing, and my signal went dead. Before I could react, it started sprinting toward me. Fight or flight kicked in, and I ran harder than I ever had, diving into my car and slamming the door shut. I floored it, speeding down the empty road, heart pounding and tears streaming. My body was trembling uncontrollably. I called everyone I could, desperate for someone to pick up. Finally, my best friend answered. I sobbed as I described what I saw, but I didn't dare say its name aloud. My muscles ached from the adrenaline, and my mind couldn't process what had just happened. Then, while talking to my friend, I saw it again. On the side of the road, running alongside my car, its glowing eyes never leaving mine. Panic surged. My friend shouted for me to get out of there, but there was nowhere to turn around. After 15 agonizing minutes, I found a clearing and slowed to make a U-turn. That's when I heard it, a piercing scream right outside my window. I floored it again, speeding back the way I came, the feeling of being watched tightening my chest. The road seemed endless, and then I saw it again. This time, it was crouched in the fetal position on the side of the road. Its head snapped up, and those glowing eyes stared directly at me. I didn't think. I just gunned it. I tried calming myself with music, but nothing helped. Then I heard tapping on my sunroof. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like it wanted me to look. Every instinct told me not to. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. The tapping didn't stop for nearly an hour until I reached a small town. I pulled over and puked, still trembling. My friend stayed on the line, talking me down, distracting me with anything he could think of. Eventually I stopped crying, but the fear didn't leave. Even as I sped home, I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see those eyes. Now I'm home. The doors are locked, the windows shut, but I can't stop shaking. That sinking feeling, like something's watching me, won't go away. I don't know what I saw out there, but it saw me, and I'm not sure it's done. It was the weekend of October 11th, 2024, when my friends and I decided to take a camping trip to Lake Kagasa State Park in Stoughton, Wisconsin. The plan was simple: hike, geocache, and enjoy the outdoors before the weather turned too cold. The park was stunning, with trails that wove through a forested area surrounding an open prairie. It felt peaceful, even serene. At least it did at first. The sun was just beginning to dip low in the sky as we embarked on our final geocaching hike of the evening. It was around 6 p.m., and though the light was fading, we still had enough visibility without flashlights. The trail circled the prairie, and we were just wrapping up when the sun disappeared behind the tree line. That's when everything changed. The forest fell silent. Gone were the constant hums of bugs and the chirps of birds that had filled the air all day. It was a quiet so unnatural it prickled the back of my neck. Then we heard it, a whistle. It wasn't a happy, carefree whistle. It was sharp, cold, and bone-chilling. Our group froze. No one spoke. Then another whistle followed, this one broken and imperfect, as though someone or something was trying to mimic a human whistle but couldn't quite get it right. Feeling uneasy, I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded too loud in the oppressive silence. A moment later, a voice responded from down the trail, startling us all. "I thought you were dogs." As the figure emerged from the forest and rounded the trail, I felt a wave of unease crash over me. Something about this person was off. They moved like a person, but I couldn't make out their face. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves or the dim light playing tricks, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The figure passed us without further comment, and though my friends and I exchanged nervous glances, we agreed not to panic. Instead, we silently decided to cut the hike short and head back to the car. That's when things got even stranger. As we walked back, keeping an eye on the trail and the woods around us, a figure appeared out of nowhere on the edge of the path. It stood motionless, staring blankly out into the prairie to our right. The atmosphere felt suffocating, heavy with dread. In a flat, emotionless tone, the figure asked, "Who's that guy?" It took me a moment to realize it was addressing me, or maybe our group. Trying to keep my voice steady, I replied, "The same guy from earlier?" Assuming it was referring to my boyfriend, who was walking behind the group. The figure didn't respond, and we didn't stop to find out. Instead, we kept walking, our silence growing heavier with each step. Every few seconds, one of us would glance over our shoulders, but the figure didn't follow. When we finally reached the car, no one spoke. We were all too shaken, but it was getting late, and we decided to stay at the campsite for the night and pack up in the morning. As we sat around the campfire trying to process what had happened, I mentioned that I couldn't make out a face on the figure. Being a cautious hiker, I make it a habit to note facial features of anyone I encounter, just in case. But with this person, there was nothing. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just an indistinct blur where a face should have been. One by one, my friends admitted they'd seen the same thing. We all described it the same way. You could tell where the facial features should have been, but they weren't there. It was like looking at a smudged image, distorted and wrong. The whistles, the blurred face, the eerie behavior, it all pointed to something far from human. My friends joked about it being a skinwalker, but deep down, none of us were laughing. Skinwalkers aren't even part of the lore in this part of Wisconsin, yet nothing else made sense. That night was one of the longest of my life. We sat huddled around the fire, feeling like we were being watched from the shadows. I'm spiritually inclined, so I performed some protection rituals around the campsite. It helped a little, enough for us to get some uneasy sleep, but the sense of dread lingered. Since that night, strange things have continued to happen. I can't explain them, but I know they're connected to whatever we encountered on that trail. If anyone wants to hear about those encounters, I'm willing to share. But for now, I just want to warn others. If you hear a whistle in the woods, don't answer. I don't believe in the paranormal. I've always trusted that science can explain anything, given enough time. That's why I can't stop thinking about what happened during the camping trip my wife Amanda and I took last weekend. It was a Saturday, and we decided to escape into the wilderness with our 2 dogs. Living in Washington State, we're lucky to be surrounded by endless forests, and outdoor adventures are our thing. When we camp, we steer clear of campgrounds and people, seeking remote, secluded spots deep in the wilderness. This time we found a place about 10 miles down an old Forest Service road on National Forest land. As we drove, we passed a few other dispersed campers along the way, but eventually found a perfect solitary spot. No cell reception, no connection to the outside world. Just us, the dogs, and the trees. That night, the temperature dropped from the 70s into the 40s. We crawled into our tent around 10 p.m., bundling up to stay warm. I'm a light sleeper by nature, waking up at the slightest sound. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, it all kept me on edge. On top of that, the dogs wouldn't settle, constantly squirming between Amanda and me, shoving me toward the edge of the tent. Still, I managed to doze off in bits and pieces throughout the night. Morning crept in slowly. Around 5 a.m., I lay in my sleeping bag, half awake, listening to the birds chirp as dawn's first light spread through the forest. It was peaceful until it wasn't. Out of nowhere, I heard a woman's voice, clear as day and close, maybe 50 feet from our tent. "Is Amanda here?" My heart nearly stopped. I froze, my body rigid with fear, and my face felt like it was burning. The voice wasn't faint or distorted. It was crisp, deliberate, and undeniably real. I lay there barely breathing, straining to hear any movement, footsteps, rustling, anything. But there was nothing, just the birds chirping as if nothing had happened. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the tent and peek outside. The forest was still, bathed in the pale morning light. I saw nothing out of place. No woman, no tracks, no sign of anyone. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream. Maybe I'd been drifting in and out of sleep and imagined the whole thing. It was so vivid, though, so real. When Amanda woke up, I told her about it. She laughed it off, saying I must have been dreaming, and I tried to let it go. Still, the unease lingered. We packed up early that morning, cutting our trip short to head home and get some chores done before the work week. But even after getting back to our routine, I couldn't shake what had happened. It's been 3 days, and I keep replaying that voice in my head. I've searched online, hoping to find someone who'd experienced something similar, or maybe a bit of folklore about voices calling out names in the forest. Nothing. I want to believe it was just a dream. I really do. But deep down, I can't convince myself. Something about it felt wrong. Too vivid. Too real. I've been wanting to share this for a while. It's been years, and I still don't have an explanation. My name's Dakota, and I've lived in Salt Lake City, Utah, all my life. I love the outdoors, hiking, fishing, camping. One of my best friends, George, often told me about his dad's property in Duchenne. It was in the middle of nowhere, with trailers scattered on a cliffside overlooking a canyon. No neighbors, no one around for miles, just complete freedom. He invited me out to visit, and I was excited to experience it for myself. The property was remote, about an hour and a half from Salt Lake. The area was rugged, full of wild animals like cougars, bears, and rattlesnakes. But we were well armed with firearms. George had just bought a sawed-off shotgun and an AK-47, and his dad had a collection of rifles and handguns. We felt safe and spent our days hunting rabbits, shooting targets, and just enjoying the solitude. But the last night, something happened that I still can't explain. George, his dad, and I were drinking and playing poker when George and I decided to head to a trailer to hang out. While George was on the phone with his girlfriend, she jokingly brought up the idea of a Wendigo, which made me uneasy. We laughed it off, but soon I noticed something strange through the trailer's window. A figure moving in the trees, trying to hide but not doing a very good job. I pointed out to George, and he immediately got off the phone. The trailer didn't have a lock, and I was starting to panic. The figure was getting closer. I could make out its neck. It was unnaturally long, almost like its head was bobbing on a loose spring. We needed to leave, so we grabbed our weapons and walked back to another trailer, trying to stay calm but alert. When we got inside, we thought we were safe. But about an hour later, we saw a shadow through the curtains, motionless, standing in the moonlight. It was the same figure. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. Things took a darker turn when I started hearing the sound of a pig oinking loudly right outside. I asked George if he heard it too, and then we both heard a disembodied voice, mocking, saying, "Oink!" It wasn't an animal. It was a voice deliberately taunting us. We didn't sleep that night, and we haven't spoken about it much since. I don't know what happened, but I'm convinced it wasn't just some prank. I don't ever want to go back to that property again. If anyone has any idea what we encountered, I'd love to know. About 9 months ago, my partner and I had just gotten a new 6-month-old boxer to keep our 3-year-old Labrador company, so we decided it would be a good idea to take them for a walk in the countryside. We live close to Hull, a city in northeast England, so we headed to a rural area north of the River Humber near the sea. We arrived at a small village near a local landmark, an old World War II Army fort. We decided to take a walk through the nature reserve and the nearby woods. The plan was to explore the area, enjoy the scenery, and let the dogs roam. We were walking along a grassy bunker toward the forest when my partner pointed out 2 young men walking up a bank from the woods, heading toward us in a diagonal path as if they were trying to cut us off. I couldn't help but notice that they were dressed oddly, both in camouflage pants, covered in dirt and dust. At first, I assumed they were part of some sort of World War II reenactment and thought nothing of it. I figured they'd pass by like everyone else, but as they grew closer, it became clear they were heading straight for us. They stopped about 10 feet away, and one of them spoke. His voice had a strange tone, almost like he didn't care about manners or even making sense. He asked where we were planning to walk, and we told him we weren't sure, that we'd just see where the path took us. The guy seemed disappointed by that and suggested we follow his route, which went through the forest to a great spot with benches where we could sit and enjoy the view. As he was speaking, the other guy kept a watchful eye on our dogs, constantly checking to make sure they were always in his line of sight. We didn't know much about the area, and we hadn't seen anyone else walking their dogs, so we took the young man's advice and followed the direction he pointed to. The forest was dim, with only about 30% of the sunlight filtering through the trees. As we walked deeper, I glanced back and noticed the 2 men were still watching us. We hadn't seen them leave the path. They stood there just watching. After a couple of minutes, our Labrador started sniffing around a bramble bush, which wasn't unusual. Both dogs were always sniffing everything. But then she started rolling on the ground, which caught our attention. When we got closer, we saw what she was sniffing, a shredded rubber pig mask smeared with some kind of brown-red liquid. It was gross, and my partner quickly pulled the dog away. Flies were crawling all over it. We didn't know what to make of it, but it didn't feel right. We continued walking, but the path narrowed as the woods turned into a long corridor of trees and bushes. We could see a turn ahead, and if it led nowhere, we planned to turn back. I walked ahead, distracted by my phone as I was about to take a picture of the woods, when suddenly I felt a sharp pain in my neck and chin. I gasped and stood still. My partner quickly stepped in and pulled thin strings away from my face, fishing lines with hooks attached. Someone had set traps along the trail. We were both terrified, confused, and angry. We didn't waste another second and hurried back to the car. But as we drove away, I swear I saw someone peeking out from behind the trees in the rearview mirror. It felt like we were being watched, and the whole experience was giving me chills. I'll never know for sure if the 2 guys we spoke to were behind the traps, but it sure seemed like it. They had watched us so closely, and then there was the mask, the hooks, the weird behavior. I don't want to make assumptions, but it felt like we were being led into something darker. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching us the whole time. It's been a while since then, but the memory still haunts me. I try not to think about it, but every time I close my eyes, I see the mask, the hooks, and the 2 guys. I'll never go back to those woods, and I can only hope I never meet those men, or whatever they were, again. A few months ago, my girlfriend and I were feeling bored, hanging around the house with no particular plans. On a whim, we decided to go for a hike. We don't hike often, but the idea sounded fun, and there was still about an hour left of daylight, so we figured we'd have just enough time to enjoy the outdoors before it got dark. We quickly grabbed our water bottles, threw on the best shoes we had, and hit the road, heading into the mountains. Where we live, there are tons of hiking trails, and they get more remote the further up you go. We usually stay near the base, where most people walk, but today we decided to take a chance and go higher up the mountain. A friend of mine had mentioned a trail that was a bit off the beaten path, so we figured we could explore it, hike for a bit, and head back before dark. When we got to the trailhead, we noticed there were no cars parked along the road. I didn't think much of it. After all, it was getting late. We still had about 45 minutes until sunset, so we carried on. The trail started with a steep downhill, followed by an equally steep uphill to regain the elevation. Once we reached the top, it flattened out and the walk became easier. As we hiked, we spotted a lone coyote off to the side and a couple of rabbits. I joked that the rabbits better watch out for the coyote, and my girlfriend playfully hit me for it. We hiked for about a mile before we came across a large fallen tree that made a bridge over a dried-up riverbed. We decided to take a break, climb around on the tree, and snap a few pictures. After about 10 minutes, we decided to continue on. Not long after, we heard something, a rustling in the trees behind us. It wasn't anything too alarming, but it was enough to make us both stop for a moment. Whatever it was sounded like it could be bigger than a squirrel, but after a quick glance, we just shrugged it off and continued walking. But my girlfriend wasn't feeling it anymore. She suggested we head back before it got too dark, and I agreed. By the time we reached the fallen tree again, I realized my shoe had come untied. I squatted down to fix it, and for some reason, I looked behind us. That's when I saw him. A person dressed entirely in black with a hood up was standing far off behind us. At first, I didn't think much of it. People hike in the mountains, right? But something about it didn't sit right. The person was far enough away that it was easy to ignore, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I nudged my girlfriend and pointed it out, trying to stay calm. As we continued walking, I noticed the person wasn't moving much. I figured they'd stay far behind, but when we came around the next bend, the person was closer, way closer, maybe 50 feet behind us. It didn't make sense. We'd been walking fast, so how could they have caught up so quickly? I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My girlfriend noticed too, and we picked up the pace. Without saying a word, we both started walking faster, and then, before we knew it, we were running. It was like an instinct, and we didn't even need to say anything. We just bolted. The trail curved sharply, and the ground was uneven, so we stumbled over rocks and loose brush, struggling to keep our balance. We didn't dare look behind us. I was too scared to see how close he was. We reached the bottom of the hill, but we still had one more incline to go. Just a short stretch and then we'd be out of there. Our breath came in gasps as we pushed up the final hill. I kept my eyes on the path ahead, trying not to fall. Finally, we made it to the top and sprinted toward the car, my heart pounding in my chest. I breathed a sigh of relief as I started the car. The engine roared to life, and I backed onto the road, my hands still trembling. That's when I looked in the rearview mirror. He was there. The man had emerged from the trailhead, and I could see him standing in the fading light. His hood had fallen off, revealing a pale, gaunt face. His eyes were wide and dead, staring straight at us. In his hand, he was holding something. I couldn't make it out, but I wasn't about to stick around to figure it out. I slammed the car into drive and sped off as fast as I could, the wheels kicking up dust behind us. I didn't look back. Night trail stalker dude, let's not meet. It was May 2009, and I had just gone through a rough breakup. After nearly 3 years together, my ex and I were stuck living under the same roof in Toronto, and it was miserable. The tension, the awkwardness, it was suffocating. To get away from all of it, a buddy from school invited me to join him on a camping and fishing trip. He grew up out in Flamborough, a beautiful area about an hour outside Toronto, surrounded by dense forests, winding creeks, and quiet, secluded fields. It sounded like the perfect escape. We set up camp near Grindstone Creek, a spot known for its great fishing, bordered by thick woods. It felt like we had the entire world to ourselves. We spent the evening fishing, talking, and drinking some craft beers, laughing about nothing and everything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we roasted hot dogs and potatoes over the fire, the crackling of the flames mixing with the peaceful sounds of nature. For the first time in days, I felt a bit of peace. By the time midnight rolled around, we were both exhausted and ready to sleep. We shared a tent, and my buddy passed out almost instantly, but I stayed awake, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, trying to wind down. It was around 1:30 a.m. when I must have finally drifted off. That's when I heard it, a high-pitched yipping sound, like a coyote, but not quite. It was sharp and frantic, a noise that scratched at my mind. At first I figured I was just half dreaming, But as I listened, it got louder, closer, like it was just outside the tent. My stomach twisted. The yipping continued, incessant, and it was starting to get under my skin. I nudged my buddy, shaking him awake. "You hear that?" I whispered. He groggily mumbled, "Yeah, what is that?" I told him it sounded like a coyote, but even in my groggy state, I started wondering, what if it wasn't? What if it was rabid? Or maybe it smelled our food. Panic crept into my chest, my mind spiraling. I have an anxiety disorder, and I could feel it taking over, my heart hammering in my chest. My buddy seemed to have the same idea. He unzipped the tent and shone the flashlight into the dark, his voice cutting through the silence, shouting, "Hey, get out of here!" I waited in the tent, heart pounding, praying the light would scare whatever it was away. Then I heard him stumble backward, his breath ragged. "It's not a coyote, man," he whispered, his face pale. "It's a dude, some weird dude." I froze. The way he said it, the fear in his voice, it wasn't a joke. His eyes were wide with terror, and in that moment, I knew something was horribly wrong. The yipping had stopped, but now the silence felt even worse. My buddy kept insisting I look outside to make sure he wasn't crazy. I hesitated, my body frozen in fear, but I had to. Slowly, I lifted the tent flap and peered into the darkness, my eyes adjusting to the faint light from the campfire. That's when I saw him. He was standing just a few feet away, swaying slightly. A man, no, not really a man. He was wearing a baseball cap, and nothing else seemed right. He was wearing women's lingerie. The sight sent a cold chill down my spine. I couldn't breathe. What the hell was he doing out there? Who was he? I snapped my head back into the tent. My buddy was whispering urgently, "We need to get out of here. What the hell is going on?" After a moment of stunned silence, we decided to confront him. My buddy yelled, "Hey, fuck off! We're trying to sleep here." For a second, everything went still. Then just as suddenly, we heard footsteps, fast, heavy, like someone running straight for our tent. My blood ran cold. They stopped right outside. I couldn't move. My buddy's voice was trembling as he shouted again, "We have cell phones in here. We'll call the cops. Just go away." The footsteps faded, and we heard the crunch of leaves as the figure moved away, heading toward the road. It was over, but the fear didn't leave. We lay there in the dark, silent and still, until the first light of morning started to bleed into the sky. When the sun finally came up, we packed up and left as fast as we could, both of us too shaken to speak much. On the drive home, we couldn't stop thinking about it, but neither of us brought it up. We were embarrassed, to be honest. Embarrassed at how terrified we had been, at how utterly powerless we felt. But even now, I can't help but wonder, what was that man doing out there? What was his goal? Was he just testing us? And if we had been a couple of girls in that tent, would things have gone differently? I'll never know, and I'm kind of glad for that. Some things are better left unknown. Well, there you have it. 10 chilling forest horror stories that might make you think twice before venturing into the woods. Remember, not all things that lurk in the forest are from this world, and some may never leave. If you've ever experienced something unexplainable in the woods, or if any of these stories hit too close to home, share your experience in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next terrifying tale. Until next time, stay safe and keep your eyes on the trees.